The year was 1828, and the prairie had begun to turn the color of worn brass. Cottonwoods along the Missouri River showed the first yellow in their crowns, and the nights carried that edge of frost which told trappers it was time to come in with their packs. On a chill morning under a high blue sky, a lone horseman rode north along the river flats toward Fort Union, the newest and proudest bastion of the American Fur Company. His name was Elias Carter, a former surveyor from Missouri, and he looked every bit the man who had ridden too far and too long. His bay mare limped slightly on a split hoof. His coat, once fine broadcloth dyed Federal blue, hung threadbare at the seams, and on his saddle, strapped tight with buckskin thongs, was a long rawhide tube darkened with age and grease. Inside it, wrapped in oiled silk, lay a map that had carried him farther than any commission from Washington ever had, a hand-drawn relic he claimed was Spanish, older than the Republic itself. Fort Union rose from the plains like a pale mirage, bastions of adobe and pine logs, its flag the stars still 24, snapping hard in the wind. Kenneth Mackenzie's men called it the Grand Fort, and for good reason. It was the master post of the Upper Missouri, a hive where Assiniboine hunters brought plues by the hundred, and where whiskey, gunpowder, and gaudy beads flowed out like a river of trade. The smell of it met Carter long before the gate did a mingling of tallow smoke, drying hides, and the sour-sweet odor of buffalo robes in stacks. From the palisade came laughter, hammering, and the steady rhythm of hatchets cutting stave wood for kegs. Charles Larpenteur, the clerk, stood near the trade room tallying packs when the rider came through the gate. He later wrote that the stranger had the look of a soldier turned wanderer, and his eyes searched the yard as if measuring it. Carter dismounted slowly, stiff from weeks in the saddle. He handed his reins to a Métis boy and stood watching a group of Assiniboine men trading robes for powder and bright cloth. He seemed less curious about the Indians than about the fort itself, the alignment of its walls, the elevation above the river, even the angle of its bastions. Old habits die slow in a surveyor. He still measured the world by degree and bearing. "Don't see many come in this late," said a voice behind him. A short, barrel-chested trapper with a grizzled beard was watching him from the shade of the trade house porch. "You from downriver?" "Independence," Carter said. "Been on the trail since June." "Then you're either lucky or touched. Riding alone up the Yellowstone way," the man chuckled. "Name's Bridger." "Jim Bridger." Carter nodded, recognizing the name. Even in Missouri, tales of the young trapper who could find beaver sign in a dust storm had drifted back east. "Surveyor, not trapper," Carter replied. "Looking for work, maybe a berth on a brigade heading south come spring." Bridger spat in the dirt. "Surveyor, eh? Ain't much call for line measuring out here, unless you plan to chart where the beaver build their dams." A few of the other men laughed. Etienne Provost, sitting on an upturned keg, asked what Carter carried in that rawhide case, a fiddle or a Bible. Carter only said, "Neither," and turned to watch the river. The traders exchanged glances. A man who kept his secrets close was seldom trusted long in the mountains. By evening, the fort settled into its rhythm. Fires crackled in the yard. The smith's hammer sang against iron. A fiddle scraped from the trade room while men shouted over whiskey and cards. Carter kept to himself, seated near the corner of the bastion wall, his horse fed and blanketed. Larpenteur, who had taken a liking to him, brought a tin of coffee and sat down beside him. "You're an uncommon sort for this country," Larpenteur said. "Most. Men come for beaver or to run from some sheriff. You looking for something else?" Carter smiled faintly. "Maybe. I once measured boundaries for the government Arkansas River country mostly. I had a partner there, name of Mallory. He disappeared 3 years ago in the Wind River Range, chasing an old Jesuit map we'd come across in Santa Fe." Larpenteur raised his brows. "A Spanish map? And you think it's worth riding clear to the Rockies over?" "Maybe not for gold," Carter said, "but the man who drew it was no fool. His bearings are sound, and he marked veins and caverns along the wind. My partner believed it led to the lost mines of San Miguel. I aim to find out what became of him and whether the map tells truth or lies." At that, Bridger, who had wandered near, let out a laugh. "Another fool for yellow dust." There's been 100 of you, Spaniards, Frenchmen, even priests, all chasing that same phantom mine. The mountains keep their secrets, friend. Better to trap beaver than ghosts." Provost nodded. "Oui." "Les montagnes avalent les hommes, the mountains swallow men." Carter said nothing. He only unrolled the top of his rawhide tube a little, showing the edge of parchment dark, brittle, lined with strange symbols. The trappers leaned closer, curiosity pricking through their mockery. On the fragment visible beneath the firelight were faint crosses and the trace of a river curling through peaks like a serpent. A note in spidery ink read, "Camino del Padre Alonso." Bridger whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks old enough. But maps don't catch beaver, mister. They get men killed." "Maybe," Carter said, "but a surveyor don't stop at the end of a trail just because others turned back." That night, after the laughter had faded and only the coyotes sang beyond the stockade, Carter sat alone by his small fire near the south bastion. From his saddlebag, he drew the rawhide case and laid the parchment carefully across his knees. The ink had faded to a rust brown, and the paper smelled of smoke and age. Across it ran a network of ridgelines, marked by tiny crosses, perhaps stations, perhaps graves. A crooked line labeled Rio del Lobo cut through the center, running toward a shaded cleft marked simply with 3 words. "Mina perdida del Padre Alonso," the lost mine of Father Alonso. Carter traced the symbols with his finger, whispering to himself the bearings he had already memorized. 3 days west of the Popo Aggie, ridge of red stone, valley of the shining cliffs. He thought of Mallory, his old partner, vanishing into those same mountains, leaving only a rumor behind. Somewhere beyond the Powder River, beyond the Bighorns, the Jesuits' trail waited, or perhaps only more empty hills and snow. The fire snapped and threw sparks against the dark logs of the fort wall. Above, the wind moved through the prairie grass with the low hiss of a distant tide. Carter rolled the map carefully, tied it again with rawhide cord, and looked eastward where the first edge of dawn was smudging the horizon. Tomorrow he would speak with the factors about joining a spring brigade toward the Wind River country. For now he let the chill seep into his bones and whispered, half to the fire and half to the ghosts of those old explorers, "If the map lies, I'll still follow it. Better a fool with a bearing than a wise man standing still." The flames guttered low, and the fort slept. Only the stranger remained awake, keeping watch over a map that the world called a myth and a promise written in ink that refused to fade. By the first thaw of spring, 1829, the river ice had begun to break in slow, grinding sheets that drifted down the Missouri like shattered glass. The yard of Fort Union buzzed with preparation. Mules braying, trade goods stacked in neat piles, barrels of powder rolled toward waiting bateaux. It was the season when brigades set out for the high country, chasing the retreating snows into valleys thick with sign and streams running cold and clear. Elias Carter moved among the bustle quietly, his gear already packed. Over the winter he had made himself useful, repairing a survey compass for one of the clerks, drafting a precise map of the Yellowstone's bends that Mackenzie himself admired. Still, he remained an outsider. The trappers called him the Map Man or Jesuit Elias, half in jest, half in superstition. He didn't fight, drink, or boast as the others did. Instead, he studied bearings, read the river's currents, and marked stars through a small brass sextant he carried in a leather pouch. That morning, as a wagon creaked toward the loading pier, a familiar voice hailed him. "You still mean to chase that priest's ghost trail?" It was Jim Bridger again, pipe clenched in his teeth, watching with amusement as Carter adjusted the pack lashings on his mare. "I do," Carter said. "There's more in those mountains than beaver. The Spaniards left signs, smelters, shafts. If I can find even one, it'll prove the map's true." Bridger laughed softly. "Prove it to who? Ain't no one in this country believes in proof. They believe in pelts and whiskey." Carter smiled faintly. "Then I'll keep the proof for myself." It was then that a wiry French Creole stepped out from the trade house, wiping his hands on a piece of tow cloth. "Monsieur Carter," he said in a lilting accent, "I hear you need a partner. I am Jacques Laramie Trapper, interpreter, sometimes thief, but only from the dead." His grin showed a gold incisor. Carter studied him, lean as a whip, eyes pale gray, hair bound in a rawhide thong, a man who had lived too long between worlds. "You know the Wind River country?" "Like a wolf knows the scent of blood. I trapped there with Sublet's men before the Blackfeet made it unhealthy." "Then we'll ride. Together," Carter said simply. They signed no papers, shook no hands. In that country, a man's word was binding enough until the mountains tested it. They left Fort Union at sunrise, 2 horses and a pack mule between them. Their route followed the Musselshell west, then angled south toward the Bighorn. The prairie was softening under the sun, herds of buffalo dark against the greening flats. At night they camped near Cottonwood stands, sharing coffee thick as tar, and trading stories to fill the long silences. Laramie was talkative, full of tales of rendezvous and narrow escapes. Carter mostly listened, sketching the day's course in his journal, careful notations of latitude, compass deviations, terrain. To Laramie it was a strange ritual. "You write the earth like a priest," he said one evening. "You think the mountains can be caught in lines?" Carter looked up from his map. "A map isn't the mountain. It's a promise to return." Laramie frowned. "Promises? Break easy out here." They rode for weeks, passing the smoking camps of migrating Assiniboine and later the lodges of crow hunters along the Powder River. The crows treated them with wary courtesy. One old man examined Carter's map and nodded gravely. Through Laramie's translation he told of red stone caverns in the mountains to the west, places where white-robed men had once dug into the hills, leaving behind strange metal tools. Carter's pulse quickened. "Ask him where." The old crow pointed toward the horizon, where the peaks shimmered in faint blue distance. "Beyond the shining cliffs," he said, "but the spirits guard it. The mountain takes what it is owed." By late June they reached the eastern edge of the Wind River Range. The mountains rose abrupt and terrible, their flanks streaked with snow and granite spires catching the sun. The air smelled of pine and stone, a clean, cold breath after months of prairie dust. Here Carter's precision became their salvation. While Laramie hunted, he surveyed each ridge and canyon, comparing them against the Jesuits' markings. His eyes, trained by years of charting river boundaries, caught patterns others missed: the tilt of strata, the angle of shadows that hinted at hidden gullies. He noted that the old Spanish bearings, written in degrees of the sun rather than compass points, aligned closely with what he saw. The map, though ancient, worked. "Your padre knew his craft," Laramie admitted one night as they sat near a small fire. "But I don't like this country. Too still, no birds." Carter didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the western sky, where clouds stacked like gray mountains over the true ones. Tomorrow they would cross into a valley he believed matched the map's heart, a place marked Valle del Lobo. That night the storm came early. Lightning clawed the ridges, wind tore through the trees. Their horses bolted, and by morning one was found lame, another gone. They spent 2 days trapped under sleet, living on parched corn and coffee grounds. When the clouds finally broke, Carter's face was raw from snow blindness, his lips split and bleeding. Laramie begged him to turn back. "There's no gold worth dying for." Carter tied a strip of smoked buckskin over his eyes to cut the glare. "Then ride back," he said. "I'll follow the bearings alone." The Frenchman cursed but stayed. "You're touched, mon ami, but no man should die without a witness." On the 3rd morning they crested a ridge of red sandstone and looked down into a narrow valley glinting with color ochre and gold, as though the hills themselves were burning beneath the sun. A river coiled through it, the same shape drawn on the map centuries before. Carter dismounted and dropped to one knee, his gloved hand sinking into the ochre dust. He lifted a fragment of dark stone flecked with metal. "Iron," he murmured, "and something else." Laramie stared, unease mixing with awe. "You've found your priest's country." "Not yet," Carter said. He looked toward the cliffs where the map showed a mark shaped like a cross. "The mine lies there, or its bones." That night, beneath a vault of stars so bright they seemed to hum, Carter sat beside the fire copying new coordinates into his journal. The wind off the peaks carried the faint metallic scent of rain and stone. Laramie watched him quietly, knowing that from this moment forward the mountains owned them both. "Jesuit's trail," he whispered. "Maybe it leads to heaven, Or maybe straight to hell. Carter did not look up. His pencil scratched across the paper, steady and deliberate, as if he were charting the edge of the world itself. By July, the grass along the river bottoms had turned the color of dry straw, and the air carried the scent of resin and thunder. The country ahead lifted in long green waves toward the Wind River Range, the Shining Mountains, as the old French voyageurs called them, and beyond that, no man's land. To most trappers, that meant danger. To Elias Carter, it meant direction. He and Jacques Laramie rode into the foothills with one pack mule and the smell of storm behind them. For weeks they had followed crow trails south from the Powder River, winding through high sage country where antelope fled in pale ribbons, and the sky seemed to begin only where the land ended. Each evening, Carter unfolded the Jesuit's map and checked the bearings against his own journal. The lines matched. The crooked valley, the ridge shaped like a sleeping buffalo, the river that bent east like a bowstring. Piece by piece, the legend was proving itself in the very bones of the earth. Laramie, for his part, was less convinced. He had begun to mutter prayers in French whenever the wind turned sharp, and his laughter, so quick and constant on the plains, had grown quiet among the granite peaks. "These hills," he said one night as they camped beneath a rock overhang. "They listen. You speak too loud, and they remember." Carter only smiled and stoked the fire. "Then we'll give them something worth remembering." They pressed higher into the country. Smith himself had crossed only a few years before. Snow still glimmered in the creases of the mountains, even under the summer sun. Streams ran quick and bitterly cold, and at dawn frost filmed their saddles. The horses grew thin. Beaver were plentiful, but Carter had little patience for trapping. He took only enough pelts to barter when they returned. Each day was a measurement, each valley a problem of distance and declination. His compass needle shivered on the brass face, steady as his resolve. Laramie watched him sometimes with something like pity. "You measure the world like a priest counting sins," he said. "Every man needs his scripture," Carter answered. "Mine just happens to be the earth." They found sign of the Crow again, old fire pits, and a single painted rock bearing the symbol of a wolf. It matched a marking on the Jesuit map, Valle del Lobo, the Valley of the Wolf. That evening, clouds massed over the peaks, and a dry wind rattled the pines. Carter studied the land while Laramie skinned a marmot for their supper. Across the valley mouth, he could see bands of red stone where the setting sun struck bare cliffs. At their base, the earth shone with strange colors: rust, gray, streaks of green. Ore country? When thunder rolled across the range, Carter's pulse quickened. He thought of the Spanish hand that had drawn these same lines a century before a priest, perhaps alone as he was now, believing that faith and geometry could hold the wilderness in check. As night came on, they sheltered under a ledge while lightning strobed the ridges. The storm turned violent. Wind howled down the gulch, and rain came sideways. At one point, their fire flashed white, snuffed in an instant. When the morning came, the ground steamed. Trees smoked at the tips where lightning had struck. Carter's clay cooking pot had cracked clean in two, baked by the heat. He turned the broken halves in his hands, running his thumb along the hardened edge. "You see that?" he said. The fire made it harder. "Bake the clay to stone." Laramie groaned, still half asleep. "You plan to build pots now?" "No," Carter said softly. "Houses." By August they had crossed into a basin no white trader had mapped. The air was thin, and the light had a peculiar clarity that made every shadow cut deep and blue. Their boots rang on stone slopes where only mountain sheep walked. In the far distance they saw a cliff face that looked as though it had been clawed by giants' vertical striations, streaks of ochre and black. Near its base ran a stream so clear it mirrored the sky. "There," Carter whispered. "That's the place." They reached it by late afternoon. The ground was littered with slag, dull gray lumps, fused with glassy streaks. Laramie kicked one and frowned. "Volcanic?" Carter crouched, picked a fragment, and scraped it with his knife. Inside glimmered a thin vein of yellow. No volcano made this. It's smelter slag. The Spaniards were here. They followed the stream until they found what looked like a fissure in the cliff. The opening was narrow, partly choked with rubble, but the walls bore marks unmistakable to Carter's trained eye, the straight, purposeful lines of a man's chisel. Inside, cool air breathed outward from the dark. They lit a torch. The passage ran 10 yards into the rock, then widened to a small chamber. The ceiling was blackened by soot, the floor littered with decayed timbers and the rusted ghosts of tools. In one corner lay a crucifix carved from cedar, its crossbar broken but still faintly showing the mark of a hammer. Laramie's voice echoed low. "Mon Dieu, you were right." Carter knelt beside the crucifix, brushing away centuries of dust. "It's not gold that matters," he said quietly. "It's proof." But even as he said it, his eyes caught a gleam in the rock, not bright, but deep, as though the stone itself held fire. He took a hammer from his pack and struck lightly. A flake came loose, showing threads of galena streaked with gold dust. Laramie swore softly. "Enough proof to hang a man." Carter turned toward him, the torchlight sharp across his face. "We'll mark the site, record it, then bury it again. No one will believe unless they see it with their own eyes, and by then it'll be too late." They worked until the torch guttered out, taking bearings and sketches. When they emerged, night had fallen fully. Stars blazed over the valley, and from somewhere in the hills a wolf howled, long and low. Laramie stared into the darkness. "He's guarding it," he said. "The old priest's ghost." Carter wiped sweat from his brow. "Then we'll pay our respects and keep his secret." For 2 days they built a small cairn of stones above the mine's mouth, marking it with a single cross made from stripped pine. Carter sealed his map in waxed linen and added a new note. "Mine located. San Miguel confirmed. Ridge 4 degrees east of true north. Leave undisturbed." When the work was done, he sat beside the fire and studied the valley one last time. The red cliffs glowed faintly under the moon. His compass needle lay still at due west, pointing toward a horizon no man had yet named. He spoke softly, half to Laramie, half to himself. "The Jesuits' trail ends here. But the mountain isn't done with us yet." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of rain and stone, and for the first time Carter felt that the map he followed might not have led him to gold at all, but into the heart of something older and far more enduring. Autumn came early to the high country. Frost crusted the sedges at dawn, and the elk began to bugle in the timbered draws. Elias Carter knew that once the snow fell heavy, the mountains would close behind him like a gate. The Spaniard's mine was no place to winter, too exposed, too haunted by rumor and storm. He and Jacques Laramie decided to build a cabin in the sheltered valley below the cliffs, close enough to guard their find, but far enough to escape the mountain's wrath. They chose a bench of ground above the creek, where spruce and aspen stood thick and straight. For a week they felled trees and dragged the logs by mule, stripping bark and notching ends with their hatchets. Carter's movements were precise, deliberate, the same precision that had guided his compass now guided his hands. He laid the foundation on true east-west lines, marking each corner with stakes. Laramie teased him. "You're building a fort, not a trapper's shanty." Carter grinned. "A surveyor can't abide a crooked wall." They raised the cabin in 12 days, 16 feet by 20, roofed with split pine and sealed with mud and moss. The fire they built in the hearth filled the room with warmth and smoke, and for the first time since leaving Fort Union, Carter felt something like belonging. He kept a small table by the window where he wrote his notes each night by candlelight coordinates, sketches, mineral samples wrapped in cloth. Yet even in comfort, unease grew. One evening, a storm rolled down from the peaks, thunder cracking, wind screaming through the timber, sparks from the chimney scattered across the roof. Laramie leapt to beat them out with a wet blanket. "If the roof catches," he panted, "we'll be cinders before dawn." Carter watched the embers hiss and die, then said quietly, "Then we'll make it so it can't burn." Laramie stared. "Can't burn? Even stone burns in the right fire." "Not if the fire's already been through it," Carter replied. The idea had taken root back when lightning split his clay pot in. 2. If flame could harden clay, then perhaps it could temper a wall. He began to experiment, mixing the red clay of the valley with river sand and ash from their fires. He packed the mixture into the gaps between the logs, smoothing it with a trowel made from bone. When the wind turned cold, he built small test fires against the wall. The next morning, where smoke had blackened the logs, the clay gleamed like dull brick, hard as stone. Laramie shook his head. "You're half mad, building a stove around yourself." "Or a kiln," Carter said. "One strong enough to outlast me." As the nights lengthened, the valley took on a stillness that pressed against their ears. Snow dusted the ridges, the creek slowed under ice. The two men hunted elk and traded with passing Shoshone bands, who eyed the strange cabin with curiosity. Carter shared tobacco and showed them how the clay turned to stone and fire. The Shoshone chief, a man with braids streaked white as frost, laughed softly, and named him Tikani Sapa Stonehouse Man. Word spread along the winter trails. When a group of trappers from the Green River Rendezvous passed through in December, they came to see the miracle cabin that could not burn. One of them, a lank Virginian named Phelps, struck a match to test it. The flame crawled over the wall, sputtered, and died. "By thunder," Phelps said, "you could set the prairie afire and still roast meat in here." Laramie grinned with pride, though he had mocked the work at first. You laugh at a man's folly long enough, and it turns to genius. But Carter only looked toward the mountains where the lost mine slept. "Genius doesn't matter," he said quietly. "Only proof. Through the long winter of 1830, they kept to their valley. The clay cabin held heat like a kiln, and the wind screamed outside without finding a seam. In January, a prairie fire swept down from the high ridges lightning again, striking dry grass miles away. The smoke came first, then a low roar like an army marching. Laramie ran to drive the horses into the creek bed, while Carter stayed behind, sealing the shutters. When the fire reached them, it was a wall of flame 20 feet high. Grass and willow exploded in bursts of orange. The air turned thick and hot enough to blister skin. Carter crouched inside, heart hammering, as the heat pressed against the clay walls. For hours the valley glowed like a furnace. Then, at last, the roar subsided. When they stepped outside, the hills were black. The pine trees stood as charred skeletons, and the air smelled of ash and rain. But their cabin stood untouched, its walls darkened but solid. Carter struck the wall with the flat of his axe. It rang like iron. Laramie let out a breath that was half laughter, half disbelief. "By all the saints," he said, "you've done it." Carter looked at his hands, still trembling. "No," he murmured, "the mountain did." In the weeks that followed, the Shoshone returned, drawn by the sight of the unburned cabin amid the ruin. They touched the walls reverently, speaking among themselves. One elder told Carter, through Laramie's translation, that the fire spirits had tested his home and found it worthy. He smiled but said nothing. He knew better than to call it a miracle. It was only a mixture, clay, ash, and patience. Yet in the quiet nights that followed, as the snow deepened and wolves sang along the ridges, he found himself wondering whether he had stumbled upon something more than chemistry. He wrote by lamplight, "If a man can make a house that withstands flame, perhaps he can make a life that does the same." When the thaw came, the cabin stood firm, red as iron in the morning light. The trappers who passed through left stories behind of a mad surveyor who built with earth and fire, of a cabin the storms could not touch. And somewhere in those stories, the line between invention and legend began to blur. Elias Carter did not mind. He was already planning his next journey back toward the mine, back toward the truth the mountains had not yet revealed. By late spring of 1831, the snows melted from the ridges, and the valley filled again with the silver rush of meltwater. Elias Carter stood outside his clay cabin, the air rich with thawing earth, and watched the sun rise over the same red cliffs that had sheltered him all winter. Somewhere beyond those spires, buried under centuries of rock and rumor, waited the secret that had drawn him here, the Jesuits' lost mine. Jacques Laramie, restless as ever, paced near the corral. "We got enough plues and trade goods to buy 10 kegs of whiskey at the rendezvous," he said. "Why go digging for ghosts now?" Carter smiled faintly. "Because ghosts leave marks. We found the slag last year. I want to see what lies beneath it." Laramie threw up his hands. "And what if it's just rock?" What if the Padre's treasure was fool's gold? Then we'll have proven something all the same, Carter replied. That a myth can be measured. They loaded their mule with picks, shovels, powder, and rations, and set off once more into the hills. The trails were rougher now, carved by spring runoff and half-blocked by fallen timber. Every bend held the memory of winter's violence. Yet Carter's stride was steady, his mind fixed on bearings and landmarks. Each ridge, each stream, matched some note from the old Spanish parchment. The farther they went, the more the map ceased to be legend and became landscape. By mid-morning of the third day, they reached the same ravine where they had found the slag. The cliff above it burned red under the sun, its face streaked with white quartz veins. Carter knelt, brushing dust from the stone. Embedded in the rock was a faint carving across within a circle. "The Jesuit's mark," he murmured. They began to dig. The air was still and dry, the sound of metal on stone echoing through the narrow walls. By afternoon, Carter's hammer struck hollow. They cleared rubble and found an opening, narrower than a man's shoulders. Inside, the air was cool and mineral, with that dry smell of long-sealed earth. They lit torches and crawled in. The passage widened to a low chamber. On the floor lay remnants of wood beams once used for shoring. Nearby, half buried in dust, Carter found a leather pouch so brittle it fell apart in his hands. Inside were rusted crucible fragments, beads of fused metal, and a coin stamped with the royal crest of Spain. Laramie stared. "Dios mío, they were here." Carter nodded slowly. "And they found what they sought." He turned the coin over in the torchlight, the gold glinting faintly. In one corner of the chamber, a small niche held a weathered tablet. Scratched into it, in Latin and crude Spanish, was a single phrase, "No oro sin fe," no gold without faith. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind moaned faintly through the fissure, like breath from the mountain itself. They spent 2 days exploring the shaft. It ran deeper than expected, branching into tunnels half collapsed. Carter measured and mapped every yard, sketching by candlelight. His journal pages filled with angles, strata notes, and assays of the ore he scraped from the walls. The readings were faint but promising trace gold in quartz and galena. Not a fortune, perhaps, but proof. Laramie grew uneasy. "This place smells of death," he muttered. "Let's take what we found and leave it buried." Carter didn't answer. He stood at the tunnel mouth, looking back toward the valley. "The Padre left his mark so someone could find it again," he said. "That someone might as well be me." The next morning they dynamited a rockfall that blocked the main shaft. When the smoke cleared, they uncovered another chamber. Inside was a wooden chest, blackened with age. Carter pried it, open with his knife. Within lay a bundle of parchment rolls and a small brass crucifix wrapped in silk. The parchment was covered in neat slanted writing calculations, sketches of furnaces, and lists of ore weights. The signature at the bottom read, "Padre Alonso de San Miguel." Laramie's face paled. "You've found him." Carter bowed his head. "Or what's left of his work." That evening they built a small fire outside the mine's entrance. Carter spread the parchments on his knees, studying the faded ink by firelight. They told a story: the Jesuits' expedition from Santa Fe northward, his discovery of mineral seams, the attacks by hostile tribes, the decision to hide the site before retreating south. The final entry read, "The mountain is both gift and judgment. Let no man seek her gold who does not also bear her silence." Carter traced the words with his finger. "He wasn't chasing riches," he said softly. "He was recording a covenant." Laramie spat into the fire. "Call it what you like. Gold's gold, and men kill for less." Carter looked up, eyes steady. "Then we'll not speak of it. The mountain will keep her silence, as he wished." They sealed the mine's mouth with rocks and clay. Carter took only one sample of ore and a copy of the Jesuits' drawings. The rest he buried again, marking the spot with a small stone cross. Before they left, he knelt and pressed his hand to the earth. "Rest easy, Padre Alonso. The world will remember you in its own time." As they rode back toward the valley, storm clouds gathered over the peaks. Lightning flickered along the ridges, painting the cliffs in silver. Laramie glanced at Carter, who rode silent and distant, the sealed parchments in his pack. "What will you do with it?" he asked. "Show it to Mackenzie? Or sell it in Street Lewis?" Carter shook his head. "Neither. The mountain's worth more than any man's price." Laramie laughed bitterly. "You'll die poor, friend." "Maybe," Carter said, "but not empty." By the time they reached the cabin, rain was falling in gray sheets. Carter built a fire and hung the wet parchments to dry. He knew others would come. Word always traveled. Perhaps someone at Fort Union had overheard too much last season. Perhaps the valley itself whispered. Outside, thunder rolled like drums of war. Inside, the firelight flickered across the stone-hard walls that refused to burn. Carter sat beside the hearth, staring at the Jesuit's handwriting. "No oro sin fe." He repeated it under his breath, not as a warning, but as a vow. He would guard the secret of the lost mines of San Miguel, not for profit but for truth. For the idea that even in a world of dust and hunger, a man could still draw a line on a map and follow it into the unknown, not to find gold, but to measure his own faith against the silence of the mountains. By the summer of 1831, the mountains had turned green again, and the rivers ran fat with meltwater. Elias Carter and Jacques Laramie rode east toward Fort Union, their packs heavy with furs and the proof of a legend, the Jesuits' maps, the samples of ore, the pages copied in Carter's own hand. The journey downriver felt longer than their climb into the Wind River Range. Behind them lay silence, discovery, and the unmarked grave of Padre Alonso. Ahead waited men who measured worth not in faith but in weight. Fort Union shimmered on the horizon, a pale shape against the flat sweep of prairie. It looked smaller now, humbled by distance and what Carter had seen. Yet when they rode through its gates, the same sounds greeted them, hammer on anvil, the laughter of traders, the clatter of Assiniboine ponies in the yard. Nothing had changed, and everything had. Charles Larpenteur was still keeping the ledgers. He greeted Carter warmly, then eyed the weathered men and their mule. "You look as if the mountains took a piece of you," he said. "Did they give anything back?" Carter smiled faintly. "Enough to prove a map was true." Larpenteur blinked. "So the Jesuits' trail wasn't just talk?" Before Carter could answer, Bridger's voice called from the porch. "Well, I'll be damned, the map man lives. Come back to sell your mountain dust or just your story?" The other trappers laughed. Carter's hand went unconsciously to the pouch at his side. He said nothing, only tethered his horse and followed Larpenteur into the trade house. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and wet leather. Kenneth Mackenzie himself sat behind the counter, tall and cold-eyed, writing in a journal. "You bring something worth my time, Mr. Carter?" he asked without looking up. Carter placed the ore samples on the table, dark, heavy stones streaked with yellow and silver. "Assayed from a sealed Jesuit shaft in the Wind River country," he said. "Documented bearings, sketches, and fragments of Spanish. Crucibles. The work of Padre Alonso de San Miguel, 1743. Mackenzie finally looked up, one eyebrow raised. "That's a bold claim." "Not a claim. A record." The factor turned a piece of ore in his hand, holding it to the lamplight. "Looks like lead to me." "It carries gold," Carter said. "Enough to prove the mine existed, though not enough to plunder." Mackenzie's smile was thin. "Proof don't fill a ledger. Gold does." He pushed the samples aside. "Still, a Jesuit mine. The company men in Street Lewis would pay for that tale alone." Carter's jaw tightened. "I didn't come to sell a tale." But Laramie shifted uneasily beside him. "Maybe you should," he muttered. "We could live soft for once." Carter gave him a hard look, the kind that needed no words. Yet the seed was planted. Later that night, while Carter slept in the yard beside his horse, Laramie slipped into the trade house and found a buyer who dealt in clay. Secrets. By dawn, half the fort knew that the Stonehouse man had struck Spanish gold. By noon, strangers approached him, trappers, traders, men he'd never met. "Where's this Jesuit mine?" they asked. "You show us the way, we'll make you rich." Others were less friendly. One shoved him near the corral. "You think you can hoard a kingdom, surveyor? Every man's got a right to the mountain." Carter ignored them all and went to find Laramie. The Frenchman sat on a keg outside the fort gate, head in his hands. "I didn't mean for it to spread," he said quietly. I just told a man we'd found something worth study. I didn't say where." Carter's voice was low, controlled. "You told enough." "They'd have learned it anyway," Laramie said bitterly. "You can't bury gold and expect it to stay hidden." Carter looked toward the distant horizon where the mountains shimmered in heat haze. "I wasn't trying to hide gold. I was trying to protect it." That evening, the first riders left the fort. Small bands of men heading southwest with greed for compass. Carter watched them go, knowing most would never return. The Wind River country had a way of swallowing those who came for wealth and not wonder. By the end of the week, the story had grown beyond control. Mackenzie ordered the rumor squelched, but the damage was done. Trappers spoke of the priest's gold and the fireproof cabin as if they were scripture. Carter burned his journals that night, one page at a time, until only the map remained, and even that he fed to the fire at last. The parchment curled, blackened, and fell into ash. Laramie approached him silently. "You're really letting it die?" Carter nodded. "The mountains gave it to men once before. We saw what they did with it." Laramie's eyes shone in the firelight. Guilt, fear, admiration. "Then, what will you do now?" Carter looked up, the glow of the burning map reflected in his eyes. "What I should have done from the start, let the earth keep her own secrets." Outside the fort walls, coyotes called across the prairie. Inside, the fire guttered low, the last curls of smoke twisting into the rafters like ghosts of everything men ruin when they try to own the wilderness. The years that followed folded into one another like pages left out in the rain. By the late 1830s, the first steamboats were pushing farther up the Missouri, and talk of new forts and new borders filled the trade houses. But among the old hands, the ones who had seen the mountains before, maps named them stories of Elias Carter. The Stonehouse man still moved along the firelight like smoke. Some said he went south with a band of Crows, vanishing into the Wind River country. Others swore he lived alone in his unburnable cabin until the end, guarding the Jesuits' secret. A few claimed to have seen him once, years later, at the Green River rendezvous, his beard gone white, his eyes still sharp as compass points. When asked if the mine was real, he only smiled and said, "The mountain doesn't lie. Only men do." Charles Larpenteur's journal for the year 1833 makes one brief note. "Heard word of Carter, the map man. A queer fellow. Built a cabin in Wind River that fire could not take. Indians call it the House of Stone." That was all a passing remark buried between entries about beaver pelts and whiskey barrels. But it was enough to keep the legend breathing. In the high country, the Shoshone told another story. They spoke of a white man who had learned the language of earth and fire, who mixed the valley's red clay with the ashes of the sky and made walls that turned flame aside. When lightning struck the ridge, his house glowed but did not burn. They said the spirits of the mountains had tested him and found his heart steady as rock. Children were warned not to wander near that valley, where, even in the fiercest storms, no grass grew for 100 paces around the old cabin, as if the earth itself still remembered the heat of the great fire that had once tried and failed to consume it. No one ever found the Jesuits' mine again. Expeditions came and went, rough trappers, prospectors, even soldiers later in the century. They all searched the Wind River Range for Padre Alonso's treasure, armed with shovels, hearsay, and greed. A few returned with stones, streaked faintly with gold. Most returned with nothing but frostbite and fever. The mountains swallowed them as it had so many before. But once, in the autumn of 1842, a small Crow hunting party reported a strange sight in a side valley of the Popo Agie. They found a cabin of red stone standing intact, while every pine tree around it lay scorched from lightning. Inside, they found only dust, a rusted compass, and a folded scrap of paper sealed in wax. The writing was faint but legible. "If a man builds with truth, not gold, the fire will pass him by." The Crows left the cabin untouched. They said the spirit of the Stonehouse man still walked there, counting the bearings of stars. Decades later, when the fur trade was only memory and the frontier had turned to map, surveyors from the U.S. Geological Corps came through that same country. Among them was a young topographer named Franklin Moore. In his report of 1871, he described an anomalous structure of fired clay and timber, evidently of early construction, partially buried by alluvial wash. Samples of the fused clay were sent to Washington. Analysis showed the material had been vitrified by intense heat, an early, perhaps accidental form of fire brick, the scientists concluded. The report filed it as Carter Site No. 1. Moore never found the mine, but he wrote in his field notes, "The walls are too deliberate to be accident. Whoever built this knew both fire and patience." I like to think he was more craftsman than dreamer. Even in the 20th century, archaeologists returned to that valley, curious about the tale. They found fragments of iron tools, glass beads, and a single Spanish coin worn smooth. In the center of the site, the floor still bore blackened marks, as if a great fire had swept through and turned the soil itself to brick. Carbon dating placed it around 1830. The researchers debated whether it was a trapper's kiln, a primitive smelter, or a shelter struck by lightning. None could agree. But when the local Shoshone elders visited, they smiled quietly and said, "It was the house that would not burn." The mountain remembers, and perhaps she does. On certain summer evenings, when the sun sinks red over the Wind River cliffs, travelers say the stones of that old cabin seem to glow not with flame, but with the memory of it. The wind moves through the valley like a whisper, carrying faint echoes of hammer and chisel, of a man murmuring to himself, as he measures a world that refuses to be owned. No one knows where Elias Carter died, or if he died at all. But the map he followed, a relic of faith and folly, led him to something greater than gold. In a country where every log rotted, every trail faded, and every man's story turned to smoke, his endured in stone. And so, long after the last beaver trap rusted away and the fur traders vanished into history, the Stonehouse man remained not in ledgers nor in treasure maps, but in the hard, fireproof memory of the mountains themselves.